So, Genesis 3 is the continuation of Genesis 2. It's written by the same author, who we call the J, sometime between 900 and 950 BC. What we learn in Genesis 2 is that in this garden there are two trees.
Two?
Yes, we need to retire that joke. You have your tree of knowledge of good and evil that you're all familiar with because that's the one that humanity's not allowed to touch. And then you have reference to a tree of life. And the only other time you see the tree of life mentioned is actually at the end of Genesis 3. So then you have this serpent that comes across Eve, and she's not really named Eve here, she's just described as a woman. Fun fact, Adam comes from a Hebrew word ha-adam that literally means earth creature. It's where we get the word human from. So one can make the case that Adam is not really male, but it being a myth story is trying to tell us something about humanity. And in Genesis 2, from Adam, God forms Eve. The Hebrew word for that literally means living or life. So you can look at this symbolically as saying, from the earth creature comes life. And this could be a story about just humanity in general and reproduction. So don't get so caught up on Adam and Eve being male and female. Myth stories are beyond gender. It's about meaning, not about the facts. Nevertheless, the serpent goes up to Eve and asks her about the trees of the garden, and she indicates that you're not allowed to eat from the tree in the middle. It's that tree of knowledge of good and evil. Now, it seems like that's a very bizarre mandate. Why would God not want us to have knowledge of good and evil? Well, there are two solid arguments that one can claim. One is that the knowledge of good and evil, what is truly good and what is truly evil, is a knowledge limited to that of God alone. So essentially, that's a tree that is producing God power. And human beings are not capable of being God, and nor is it part of God's plan and his order of creation that we are of God. Another theory, and I kind of like this one, it's almost as if God prefers that we remain in a, figuratively speaking, ignorance. You heard the expression, ignorance is bliss.
Ignorance is bliss.
Let's think about this. In the creation stories, as of right now, humanity only knows of God, and they are in direct communion with God. So God is all they know.
That's all I know.
And the result is it's pure harmony. It's what we said was original justice. Everything is great. And the tree of knowledge of good and evil is going to now make humanity aware of the choice of evil. Well, we said human beings have free will, which is arguably why the trees are put in the garden to begin with, so that one can exercise the option of free will if they want. The humans, when they eat of the fruit of knowledge of good and evil, are now aware that evil exists. And they become aware, and they say later on, they become ashamed, and they hide themselves for they're ashamed because of our, we'll use the word concupiscence. Concupiscence is the tendency for humanity to choose what we're not supposed to choose. How do you define evil? I define evil as the absence of God. So what happens when humanity eats of that fruit is they are envisioning themselves not needing God. They are essentially saying, I don't need God. And that's ultimately the sin of Adam and Eve's story. The sin is not so much about fruit. And by the way, there is no apple. There's no apple ever talked about in the Bible anywhere. So don't say it's an apple. It's not about them eating fruit that God forbade. It's the motivation for eating the fruit. The serpent tells Eve and convinces her, you will become like God. Genesis 1 and 2 says that we are creatures of God, not equal to God. So she is enticed by this offer to become like God. The great irony, of course, is that we're already made in the image of God. We already have a superiority, a dominion over the rest of creation. We are more like God than the rest of creation is like God. But the serpent convinces Eve we're not good enough, that we should strive for the unattainable, that God made us deficient, that God made us flawed. So let's rise above our nature and become something we weren't meant to be. So we are defying our order of creation. We are defying God's plan for us. We are defying God's will for us. We're saying, God, I could have done better. I don't need you. So we're rejecting our place in creation, but at the same time, we're rejecting God. We're rejecting God's plan for us. We're saying we could do better. Well, is that not temptation? Is that not why we sin? When we sin, we're constantly rationalizing our decisions. That's what we as human beings do. When we do something wrong, we convince ourselves that at this time it's going to be okay. Even if it's just a temporary wrong, I'm not going to make a habit out of it. We call that rationalization. So the motivation behind them eating the fruit is them telling themselves that they don't need God. You'll see this from time and time again throughout scriptures, but most immediately you'll see it in Genesis 11, Tower of Babel story, where the sin of humanity in that story again, written by the same author, J, is that the human beings want to build a tower to heaven so that they can be on the same level as God. We learn nothing from previous stories. Have you ever seen the movie Jurassic Park or the classic book Frankenstein or H.G. Wells' The Island of Dr. Moreau? These stories are all about humanity playing God. And that is going against Genesis 1 and 2. When humanity wants to be what we are not, problems ensue. Chaos emerges. I've talked about this before. God creates an orderly world. Human beings are going to muck it up. So what is the most immediate effect, the most immediate consequence of them eating the fruit? They become ashamed of themselves. It's probably due to that concupiscence, that tendency to evil. They realize that, man, maybe I kind of like this. Or just that thought of why I betrayed God. I'm ashamed now of something so loving to me that I have defied it, and I want to hide myself. I want to cover myself up. And the nudity example is really rich imagery, because when you're nude, you are pure. There is nothing to hide. You can look at people in the eyes, right? You can look up and see the beauty around you, but that's not what happens with Adam and Eve. With Adam and Eve, they cover themselves up. They cover themselves up. They're hiding themselves. Well, I don't know. When you try to cover yourself up, does your chin still aim high, or does it look down to the ground? Do you try to conceal? Well, if you're concealing, you're not living. You're not being true to you anymore. You're not being true to your nature. You're hiding from your nature because you are ashamed of it. So now you are preventing your full humanity from being displayed because now you want to keep it away. You're embarrassed by it. So the initial result of the original sin is despair to what it means to be a human. And I mentioned Michael Hymes's book before about how Jesus becoming incarnate, God becoming a human, takes away that despair and makes us recognize that there's actually some beauty involved in being human. We don't need to hide it. And when God then calls them out and says, Adam, why did you do this? What does he do? He says, God, it's that woman that you put here with me. Look at what Adam's doing. And it's just like us when we sin. He's scapegoating. He's blaming her and blaming God for putting her with him. I'm innocent. I'm an innocent victim.
I didn't do anything wrong.
Oh, no? Let me show you something.
Go on, try it.
Boom! Right there! What do you call that, huh?
So then God asks the woman, why did you do this? And the woman says, it's that serpent. Scapegoating again. She doesn't say, it's that serpent that you put here with me, but we all know that God put the creatures in the garden. So technically she's saying, it's that serpent that you put here with me. I am totally just a victim. Etiology is a fancy word for an origin story. You'll see this throughout Genesis, but an etiology is an attempt to explain something's cause or origin. And by the end of Genesis 3, the etiologies present are why is childbirth so painful? Why is going to work so painful? Why do snakes slither upon the ground? Because God does curse the serpent here, so arguably the serpent was upright in the original view of creation. And why is there death? Now there are scientific explanations, but during this era, the Israelites were unaware of why these things happened, so they created etiologies. You'll see this a lot throughout Genesis. Myths are attempts to explain why things are the way they are. And Jay is saying that all that pain is associated with the downfall of humanity, as evident by them eating the fruit. So what about that other tree? God expels Adam and Eve from the garden, and they put a guard there at the gate.
We're guards. We're guards, aren't we?
To prevent them from coming back in to eat of the tree of life. There's no mention prior to this story that Adam and Eve could not eat of that tree of life. If you eat of that tree of life, you're going to essentially be immortal. Do you see why God doesn't want now this to happen? Human beings are now in a state of despair. They're in a state of shame. Is this what we want immortality to stem from? Human beings need to be fixed first. We need to be redeemed, which is the mission of Jesus, of course. God does not want humanity to be in an immortal state of despair. The woman is named Eve by Adam after the fall. And now this is the first time where you see gender subordination. Gender subordination was not part of God's original plan of holiness and justice. It is the result. Inequality is the result of sin. Sin. Now I mentioned in the last season that the Greek word of sin is this H word right here that literally means separation or alienation. And I want you to understand this about original sin. Because we typically have this confused approach to original sin as being almost like a spiritual STD that's passed down from Adam and Eve. Original separation is what results from the Adam and Eve story. You can only understand original separation by contrasting it with the original holiness and justice model that God intended for us in Genesis 1 and 2. We as human beings are born into a world that is not the Garden of Eden. We do not see God face to face. So what is the most important truth one can learn from Genesis 3? Know your place. Know and respect the order of creation. That there are limitations to creation. You can't defy those limitations. When you defy them and want to be God and say, I'm better than those limitations, that's when problems are going to result.